Thank you guys for that. Well, happy Mother's Day to all the moms. And for those moms who are watching online, we're glad you're watching. We do have a special gift for all the ladies today. Before you leave, make sure you pick that up in the lobby. Also, at the end of the service, we're going to be recognizing some special categories of moms, as we always do. So whatever you do, don't leave early. Now, you should never leave early, but especially don't leave early today. Not only because of we're going to recognize some moms, we also have a very special announcement that we're excited to share with you. We've sort of been hinting at this for several months, so we're excited to give you a little more information today. So stay tuned. Have you ever noticed that the language we use changes over time? Sometimes certain words fall out of use, other words get developed, and occasionally words even get redefined. Since 1847, when the first Webster's Dictionary was first published, the editors have been engaged in this never-ending process of trying to stay up to date. And just since the year 2000, there have literally been over 100,000 revisions to the printed version of the dictionary. At the beginning of 2021, as a part of one of those revisions, the editors added 521 new words to the dictionary for the first time. And what makes this interesting is that on any given year, the words that are added to the dictionary are normally a response to whatever's going on in the culture at that moment. For example, one of the words that was added this year is the word crowdfunding. If you've ever seen a GoFundMe page being shared around on social media, that's an example of crowdfunding. Another phrase that entered the dictionary for the first time in 2021 was the phrase second gentleman. For the first time in history, we've got a female vice president, so her husband is now the second gentleman. Here's another word that was added this year that I thought was especially interesting. I want to put it on the screen just so you can see it. It's called a pod or a bubble. And what it is a usually small group of people, such as family members, friends, co-workers, or classmates who regularly interact closely with one another, but with few or no others in order to minimize exposure and reduce the transmission of infection during an outbreak of a contagious disease. Now, if you're a sports fan, you heard a lot of talk about bubbles and pods as teams tried to keep their own bubbles tight so that players wouldn't get infected and miss games. But whether or not you're a professional athlete, you have your own pod, you have your own bubble of people that you hang out with, people that you're close to. There's one more word that I wanted to share with you. It's not new. It was first included in the dictionary in 2003. But if you're like me, last year was the first time you ever heard it used, and it's the phrase social distancing. The practice of maintaining a greater than usual physical distance from other people or of avoiding contact with people or objects in public places. Now, if you're like me, you're probably sick of hearing about this. But researchers are now telling us that there's another type of distancing that has sort of evolved over the last few months, the last 14 months, that's been even more disruptive and more frustrating than social distancing, and that's relational distancing. Some of you have experienced that. Maybe you used to have a close circle of friends that you enjoyed hanging out with, you enjoyed doing things with, but now over the months that have passed, you've sort of drifted apart, and you don't get together near as often as you once did. Relational distancing is what happens when people who were once close together begin to drift apart. And it doesn't just happen to friendships. The same thing can happen to families. And you know how it happens. Usually it starts out pretty small. So dad starts to spend more time watching SportsCenter and American Pickers than he does engage with the people around him. Mom spends more time looking at recipes on Pinterest than she does talking to her kids. And you may have a situation where like the kids are all home. I mean, they're in the physical structure, but they're in their room. They're on their iPad. So everybody's sort of there, but nobody's really all there. The great missionary Jim Elliot used to say, wherever you are, be all there. But you know as well as I do that in 2021, that's not the way that most of us operate. So here's the question I want us to think about. What do you do when relational distancing invades your bubble? If you have your Bible, I want you to open up to Mark chapter 3. We're in week 2 of the series that we're calling Family Fix Up. And each weekend we're looking at either one thing Jesus said or one thing that Jesus modeled that we can implement in our own lives to improve our relationships with the people closest to us. Now, as I said last week, depending on your situation, you may think that none of what we're going to talk about this month applies to you because of your situation. But I want you to know, whatever context you're in, the principles that we're going to talk about can be applied to any relationship. Friendships, extended family, work relationships, immediate family. Any relationship can benefit by doing some of the things that we're going to talk about. And this morning, the question we're going to focus on is, what would it take for all of us to be less distant and more present in our relationships with the people closest to us? As Mark chapter 3 opens, Jesus is just beginning this 3-year period that's known as his public ministry. He's already preached his first sermon. He's already announced the arrival of the kingdom of God, and he started to perform some miracles in strategic locations. Because of that, he's also starting to get a lot of attention. So in the first paragraph in Mark chapter 3, Jesus goes to a synagogue like he did every weekend, and while he's there, he heals a man who has a crippled hand. It's a really cool story, but the Pharisees who were there at that time, who were watching this, are upset by that because Jesus did that on the Sabbath day, and they considered that to be a violation of the Jewish law. The people in the seats, though, they don't care about that stuff. I mean, they're excited, so word starts to filter out as to what Jesus is doing, and then all of a sudden, you've got this situation in which anybody who's within walking distance of where Jesus is, who has anything wrong with them, starts to show up. I mean, if Jesus is going to start healing people, they want to be in on it. Check out the way Mark describes this in verse 7, Mark chapter 3. Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the lake, and a large crowd from Galilee followed. When they heard about all he was doing, many people came to him from Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, and the regions across the Jordan and around Tyre and Sidon. Because of the crowd, he told his disciples to have a small boat ready for him and to keep the people from crowding him. For he had healed many, so that those with diseases were pushing forward to touch him. Whenever the impure spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, "You are the Son of God." But he gave them strict orders not to tell others about him. Try and imagine this. Almost literally overnight, Jesus has become a rock star in that region. Everywhere he goes, the massive crowd quickly assembles, and the people come from every direction, and all of them are in desperate need. They're crippled people and poor people and people with mental health issues, and everybody wants a small piece of his attention. So in verse 7, Mark tells us that even when Jesus tried his best to get away from the crowds and to get in a boat, there was just no escaping them. So you get to verse 12, and Jesus tells the people, hey, don't tell anybody else about me. And the reason he doesn't want them to tell anybody is because he doesn't want anybody else to show up. It was just this inescapable pressure that came with the constant demands that were being placed on him. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever lived with that kind of unrelenting pressure? Some of you have lived with it for a long time. Some of you are in jobs where it feels like you're on call 24/7. And you know if something goes wrong, it'll be your phone that rings and your email inbox that fills up first. And because of that, even when you leave your job, even when you leave the office never really leaves you. You can be 100 miles away physically and still be there mentally. There's always one more email to return, one more phone call to make, one more form to fill out. And so it feels almost impossible to really disconnect from all that. Or maybe it's not your job. Maybe it's this unrelenting pressure that you feel to have the perfect family with kids that are involved in everything. And you know how it goes. Maybe in your head you have this vision of what you want this to look like. And it's a spotless house and, home-cooked meals that look like the recipes you saw on Pinterest and immaculate flower beds and a close-knit family like the ones you see on Instagram. And at the same time you're trying to do all this, you've got practice schedules and piano recitals and homework and after-school programs and all the rest of the stuff that eats up so much of our time. So the end of the day comes, you don't feel much like a parent. You don't feel like you've connected with anybody. You feel more like an event coordinator or maybe an Uber driver. I told you last weekend that I'm not really an expert at any of this. In fact, there's a couple things we're going to talk about during this month that I am a little bit afraid God's just going to strike me dead, because this is not something that I do very well. I'm more of a fellow struggler. But because of what I do, it's easy for me, and maybe you've done this, I'll find myself, sitting in a crowded restaurant surrounded by people I love, and just for a moment, I'll be completely zoned out, thinking about some message I need to prepare, or some funeral that's coming up, or some meeting that I'm getting ready for. Maybe you've done that too. It's easy just to zone out and lose connection with the people around you because you've got all these demands, and it can be a little bit overwhelming. Some of you can relate to that. But here's what I'm learning. I think a big part of the reason we struggle with being distant in our relationships is at least partly because of the increasing number of demands that we keep allowing to be placed on us. I think that's what Jesus was dealing with in Mark chapter 3. Man, you talk about being pulled in every direction. Here's a guy, he can't even take a step without encountering somebody that wants something from him. That's why what Jesus does next is so important. Rather than seizing that moment, rather than trying to gather all these people, hey, let's build an empire, let's start an army, he does something that seems counterintuitive. He pulls away from the crowd and he goes up on a mountainside to pray by himself. And then when he gets done praying, he does something even more incredible. Check this out, verse 13. Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. He appointed 12 that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. These are the 12 he appointed. Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder, Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Now, this is the moment that Jesus chose the men who would essentially be his family. They traveled together, they worked together, they ate their meals together, they talked together for the most important 3 years of his life. They were right there with him. You get down to verse 34, Mark 3, Jesus even refers to them as his family. It's a good reminder that sometimes your family's more than who you're related to. It's who you choose to spend your time with. And if you were trying to put together a team of people to be your family or a group of people to lead your church or to start a business with, these would probably not be the guys you chose. And yet Jesus saw something in them that caused him to choose them, to invite them into his inner circle and to spend time with him and to essentially be his family. But verse 14 is kind of the key verse because that's where Mark tells us why Jesus did this the way he did. Here's what it says. He appointed 12, now check out this line, that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach. In order to achieve his long-term goal of inaugurating the kingdom, rather than digging in with the crowd, Jesus chose to pour his life into a small group of people that would eventually carry on his legacy. Now here's the kicker. If you're a parent or a grandparent, if you're a person that has any influence at all over other people, you have the same opportunity to do exactly what Jesus did. The problem is, for most of us, we're too distracted, we're too busy, we've got too many demands to even notice the opportunities that are already there that we just keep passing over. So as we go through this story, we're going to look at the example of Jesus, and there are 3 key ingredients that he uses to impact the people closest to him to have a lasting effect. And here's the first one, if you're keeping notes, it's attention. It's attention. And it's not the kind of attention that most of us have. This is the kind of attention where you focus on who and not what. Now, if you're a parent, I want you to imagine that when you came in this morning, you were handed a blank sheet of paper and somebody told you, hey, I want you to make a list of everything that you hope your kids one day accomplish. Now, my suspicion is you probably already have some version of that list, already in your mind. But if you had to put it on paper, what would you write down? Maybe a certain GPA, certain points per game, certain ACT score, a scholarship to a certain school, certain kind of job, certain income, certain kind of house. I mean, we all have this vision of what we hope our kids accomplish. But have you ever noticed that most of what we think about, most of our dreams for our kids are focused more on what they'll do more than who they'll become? You ever noticed that? So because of that, we spend most of our money, most of our energy investing and trying to put them in a position where we think they can succeed at what they might choose to do rather than who they're called to be. And so we're more concerned about helping them build a more impressive resume or land the right internship so they can get the right job or get a certain income so they can be in a certain tax bracket more so than we are helping them become the kind of people that God wants them to be. If you go back to verse 14, though, you see that Jesus took the complete opposite approach. Rather than focusing on what he wanted these 12 guys to do, which was eventually to preach and to start churches, he instead focused on who he wanted them to become. He said, first, I want you just to come and be with me. And then we'll worry about what you do later. Now imagine how different your life would look and your relationships would look if when you were handed that piece of paper and asked to write down the list of things that you hope your kids accomplish, rather than writing down what they'll do and what they'll accomplish, you wrote down things like, I really hope they have an intimate relationship with Jesus. I really hope that they live a life of service to others. I hope they develop a heart of joy. I hope they have a life that's filled with deep friendships. If that was your goal, how would that change the way you spend your time? What activities would you have to start to help them become those kind of people rather than worrying about what they accomplish? How about this? What kind of activities would you have to let go of in order to put them in a position to make more time to focus on who they'll become? See, if you're a parent or someone who has influence over other people, we're all going to have to learn to pay more attention to who the people around us are becoming and less attention to what they're doing. Now, here's a second ingredient. It's time, and it includes both quality time and a large quantity of time. Back in the 1970s, the phrase quality time began to appear in magazines and newspaper articles, and was focused on the challenge. People were feeling this pressure. We're trying to build a successful career, and I want to maintain a healthy family, and how do I do that? And more women were entering the workplace, and the average number of hours worked for everybody was continuing to climb, and so people felt the tension of these two competing interests. So the answer for a lot of people was this concept of quality time. The idea was, hey, if I can't spend a lot of time with the people closest to me, then at least I'll try to make the most of the time that I do have. And so what happened is we began to schedule our family time just like we scheduled our work events. So we'd say, hey, at 4 o'clock, I've got a work meeting at the office, and at 5 o'clock, I'm going to spend some quality time from 5 to 5:45, and then I've got to finish up my day. And you know how it goes. We begin to view all of this through the same lens. I've got to protect that quality time. And then what happened is that in an attempt to ensure that our time together really would be special, a lot of people started to put a lot of thought into how they could manufacture some of those special moments. So now all of a sudden, hey, it's not enough for us to just have some unscheduled time on the weekend. It's not enough for us to randomly go get ice cream after school one day. We've got to have something really memorable scheduled. So we've got to have a big party. We've got to have a big event. We've got to take a big trip and create some memories. The problem with that is, and you know this is true, certain moments can't be scheduled. They have to be spontaneous. One family counselor said this. He said, no matter how hard we try, we cannot engineer or create upon demand the magical moments of life which actually occur when we are least expecting them. We cannot force a child or an adult to open up emotionally upon demand. We cannot expect someone to fulfill our expectation of playing or performing the role or function of producing a meaningful interaction within a tiny allotment of time. See, those moments that most of us are looking for can't be put on a schedule. They flow out of the time that we're already spending together. And if you look at the way Jesus approaches, you'll see that he understood that most of what we consider to be real quality time flows out of a significant quantity of time in which we're already together. Dr. Robert Coleman calls this the with principle. Jesus first invited these 12 guys to come be with him in hopes that eventually they would become more like him. So they were always with him everywhere he went, every meal. I mean, they were already there. So when those special moments did occur, they were right there with him. The quality time flowed out of the quantity of time that they were already spending together. There's one more ingredient that you see modeled here, and this is the idea of consistency. If you want this to work and you really want to build relationships with the people closest to you, you're going to have to establish some sort of a rhythm. Let me give you 3 quick ideas for how you can practically do this. The first is the idea of a daily conversation. Every single day, you should have at least a few minutes where you have a conversation, even if it's brief, with the people closest to you. You check in, you check on one another. Some people do this around the dinner table. Other people do this right before they go to bed. I mean, it doesn't matter when you do it. The main thing is you just figure out what works for you, and you do it every day. A second way you can do this is the idea of a weekly activity. If you have kids at home, you should find something that everybody can do together every week to help strengthen the relationship. Maybe it's a family movie night. Maybe, one night a week you cook dinner together. A lot of people do this on Sunday after church, kind of their Sunday lunch. For other people, it's a Saturday afternoon watching football. I mean, it could be anything, but whatever it is, you find what works for you, and you just make it happen week after week. A third thing you can do that can really help are these monthly events. What if one Saturday every month, everybody that you're close to, everybody in your family just cleared their schedule and you did something special? A trip to the zoo, a concert, a bluegrass festival, a day at the lake, some sort of cookout. Man, you invite your friends, your close friends, your family. And the idea is at least once a month you do something out of the ordinary, something you don't normally do, and you just spend time with the people that are closest to you face to face. And the idea is, if you do this long enough, you have enough daily conversations, you participate in enough weekly activities, you have enough monthly events that eventually some of those moments that can't be scheduled start to take place. But there's a challenge in all of this, and you know what it is. Because here's the deal. I didn't say anything in the last 20 minutes that you didn't already know. Everybody knows, man. Everybody knows this stuff. If I gave you a piece of paper and said, hey, make a plan for how you can grow closer together, some of you could have come up with exactly what I said with no problem. Everybody knows, and everybody can come up with a plan for how to accomplish it. The challenge, though, is that as you try to actually do these things, as you try to build these into your life, there are some really hard decisions that have to be made. Some of you are in positions in which there are a lot of demands being placed on you. And you feel like, man, if I don't do my best to meet these demands and keep everybody happy, then the whole thing is just going to fall apart. I feel that too. I want to show you a picture. I keep this picture on the corner of my desk downstairs. That's my grandpa preaching what I think was his last sermon, just at a church outside of Lexington just a few years ago. And I don't know who took the picture, but there it is. It's on my desk. And my grandpa was a Methodist preacher, much better than I am. But back in the 1970s, late 70s, he preached at a church in northern Kentucky, growing community, growing church. And while he was there, things went really well for him. And they were able to relocate. They had an old building that was downtown in this town, and they sold that, and they bought some property out on the main highway leading into the town, developed the property, built a really nice modern building, and things just went really well for the time he was there. And then, after a couple years after they relocated, he decided to sort of retire from that, and he started traveling around and preaching. Now, some of you remember this. If you grew up in church, back in the 70s and 80s, churches had all these revivals, right? So what would happen is some church somewhere would bring in some big dog preacher for a week, and they'd preach every night, and then the preacher would move on the next week. That's just how it went. So that's what Pop did for a period of years. There were literally seasons of his life where he might have been home, one night in 7 weeks because he was preaching somewhere different just every night. Unfortunately, though, after he left the church there in northern Kentucky, he was gone for 5 or 6 years, and things just went dramatically south. I mean, people stopped coming, people stopped giving, and now all of a sudden, they're in danger of closing the door. They're going to lose their property, they're going to lose their building, and if something doesn't happen, they're just going to close the door for the last time. So they did something very unusual, especially in the Methodist church. They invited him to go back. So there's like this 5 or 6 year gap, and he goes back to this church that he had helped to relocate years earlier. So he goes back and he pours himself into the mission, and all of a sudden things start to pick back up, and people start to come back, and people start to give, and pretty soon it's rolling again, and they pay the debt off, and everything's in a really good and healthy place. And so he retires a second time from the church, and he goes back into traveling. Now fast forward to 3 years ago. I had to be in Cincinnati for something, and I'm driving down I-75 heading towards Cincinnati, and I look at my watch, and I realize I'm going to be really early for whatever it is I was going to. So I thought, I've got a little time. I'm going to pull off the road here, and I'm going to find this church. I'm just going to see what's going on. So I do. I get off the interstate, take the exit, find this church, drive into the town, and there it is right on the main highway, and beautiful, looks great. So I pull into the parking lot, and I have like vague memories of this, like when I was a kid. And I go in the parking lot, and over here on the right, this house they lived in, and then over here, and here's this church. So I'm just kind of checking things out, right? So I drive around for a minute. I pull in a parking spot. I get out of my car. I'm just sort of walking around, kind of having a moment. You've done that. And about 10 minutes into this guy comes out of the building. And I don't know if he saw me on a camera or just, who's this weird guy that's walking around, But he comes out and he asks me what I'm doing, and I kind of explain it, and he introduces himself, and we talk for a minute, and then I get back in the car, and I go to my meeting. It occurred to me later that Pop retired from that church in the summer of 1989. And now, 32 years later, if you were to go to that church on a Sunday, you might find 2 or 3 older people who vaguely remember his name. And if you think I'm overstating that, I'm going to read a list of names. And if you recognize any of these names, I want you to raise your hand, okay? Just raise your hand if you recognize any of these names. Andrew Hope, Lawrence Williams, James Parks, Harry Satterfield, John Chambers, Malcolm Leach, Delmer Rogers, Gary Howe, and Frank Bruning. 4 people. And all of those guys were the preachers here. If you go down the steps out there, there's a little plaque to the left, and you'll see all the names of people who served as the preacher here since 1831. In fact, I looked again this week, and Lawrence Williams was actually the preacher here twice. I don't know the story, but I really don't know anything about any of these guys. But here's what I do know. One day in the future, that same thing's going to happen to me. 30 years from now, there's going to be people standing out there, and somebody's going to say, who was that preacher we had in 2020 and 21? There's going to be an awkward pause. And the other person's going to say, I remember he was incredibly handsome, but I can't remember his name. And that's how it goes, man. My friend Bob Russell preached at Southeast Christian for 40 years in Louisville. When he retired, he promised to stay away from the church for a year, just not to be a distraction. That year was up. He went back to the church that he preached at for 40 years. Walked in the first time after that year was over, and the usher at the door handed him a visitor's card. To add insult to injury, he walked into the lobby, and he saw a guy that he recognized, and he recognized him. He come over, they have a nice conversation. As they're ending the conversation, the guy shakes his hand. He said, "It's good to have you back, Bill." And that's what happens, man. That's the way it goes. You need to understand, same thing's going to happen to you. One day, the crowds are going to forget your name, and that boss that's always breathing down your neck, demanding more out of you, man, they're going to replace you 30 seconds after you walk out the door for the last time. The business that you're giving 80, 90 hours a week to at the expense of everything else is one day going to close its door for the last time. And the bank account that you think represents the empire that you're building is one day going to have a balance of 0. And that job that's eating up your life that you think is so important is going to belong to somebody else. So if you want to invest your life in something that's going to last, you need to invest it in the people that are closest to you. Because when it's all said and done, they're the only ones they're going to remember. That's what Jesus did, and it was because of his consistent investment in a few unimpressive men that he was literally able to change the world. You go back and you read the history of those 12, all but one of them traveled the world, man. They planted churches, and they became the foundation blocks that the church is built on even today. And all of that happened because Jesus chose to pull back from the crowds and to pull back from the demands that were being placed on him. And he chose to spend large amounts of uninterrupted time with a few key people. Now here's the question. Who is it that you need to spend more time with? Now if you're a parent or a grandparent, that's easy. You don't have to even pray about it. You don't have to talk to anybody because you already know. If your situation is different, my suspicion is if you pray about it long enough and think about it, the Holy Spirit will bring somebody into your mind, and before this day's over, you'll know who it is you're supposed to invest your life in. But the challenge is, you then have to do it. I want you to stand with me. Just a second. We're going to sing what we call an invitation song. The idea behind it is if you feel like the Holy Spirit is prompting you to make some sort of public decision, you want to pray with somebody, want to move your membership, whatever you feel like you need to do, we want to help you. But it's really hard to talk about something like this without talking about another type of distancing that sometimes happens, and that's spiritual distancing. Maybe at some point you felt like you were closer to God, closer in your relationship with him than you are now. And it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, he's there. The door's open. So if you need help figuring out how to get back to where you need to be spiritually, David and I will be here. You don't have to say anything. It's not going to be weird. If you want to talk to us after the service, we'll be around. Just grab us. But whatever you need to do, we pray that you'll do it.